hello from Vancouver. There you are.
Hi.
How are you doing?
Good. How are you?
I'm okay. I'm doing good. Technology is so fun, isn't it?
It's pretty amazing.
I know. I know. Thank you so much for being here. I don't know if you caught my intro, but I was sharing how I was initially introduced to you as a mindfulness practitioner at Wisdom 2.0, and it was, you took the stage, and everybody was so enthralled. You could hear a pin drop. It was really beautiful.
Thank you. I had so much fun doing that.
Yeah. So there's so many things that I want to talk to you about. Um, One of the first things that I was thinking would be kind of interesting to discuss is just that so many of us that come to mindfulness, I think a lot of instructors and a lot of long-term practitioners, I think that people are under the impression that all of us have lived a pretty calm existence because they see us as we are practicing or as we are instructing. And what I have found is that most of us who are on a long-term serious path have actually come to it because we've suffered from a lot of challenges in our life and a lot of trauma. I mean, different things cause us to lean into mindfulness, but I was curious just to hear a little bit about your path. You have such an interesting one. I know you've experienced homelessness and you had such a unique upbringing. So I'd love to hear a little bit about that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's true. I think I had a really diverse background, I guess you could say. My parents were musicians, and I started singing with them when I was 5. My mom left when I was 8, and my dad took over raising us, but he had really bad PTSD, which I don't think we knew about. I don't think we knew that word back then. He was a Vietnam vet, but he'd also had a very abusive childhood, to the point where when he went to Vietnam, it was relaxing to him. And that's when he was like, oh,
Wow.
that means I'm in trouble. It means my childhood was really bad.
Mm-hmm.
My dad didn't want to grow up repeating his childhood, but when you only have a hammer, you're going to use a hammer until somebody gives you a screwdriver. And so he started drinking to try and handle his PTSD. When he started raising us, it went pretty predictably, and I moved out when I was 15. And I knew that statistically kids like me end up repeating the cycle, and I didn't want to be a statistic. And I started reading philosophy maybe a year prior to me moving out. So I'd been turned on to the dialectic and the power of thought. And I thought maybe I could think my way out of the upbringing. If I wasn't taught happiness in my household, was it learnable? Was it a learnable skill? Was it a teachable skill? And so I set out very optimistically to try and not be a statistic, to learn what I called a new emotional English. We're raised with an emotional language in our house, and it's kind of invisible to us. We're not as aware we're learning it the same way we're aware we're learning math, for instance. And I knew my emotional English was terrible. It wasn't a great emotional language. And so I really thought about, how do I deliberately try and learn a new one when there's no school to go to? There's no human school, if you will. So I did really well for quite a while, until you fast forward about 3 years. I did graduate high school. I did good for myself, considering what I was in. But when I wouldn't sleep with a boss, he fired me without giving me my paycheck. I thought, no big deal. I'll live in my car for a few months, get back on my feet. But then my car was stolen. And my panic attacks really took off to a whole new level. I'd started having panic attacks when I was 16. Again, I didn't know what they were. I'd never heard the word panic attack for many, many years, till well after being homeless. And I became agoraphobic while I was homeless, and I was shoplifting. And one day I was in a dressing room trying to steal a dress, and I saw my reflection in the mirror, and I went, I'm a statistic. Like, I didn't beat the odds. I'm homeless, and I'm going to end up in jail or dead if I don't turn my life around. And I remember this quote by Buddha that said, happiness doesn't depend on who you are or what you have. It depends on what you think. And I had this really weird privilege of being stripped of everything but my thoughts. And so I decided to focus 100% of my attention on my thoughts. And that led me on a mindfulness journey. That word wasn't around then either. Meditation was a word. We'd heard that word. I had heard that word. Mindfulness just means being consciously present. That's how I define mindfulness. It's the willingness to be consciously present. And what I learned that year is how much my worry and fear and anxiety was robbing me of the only chance to keep myself safe. And that's the great lie of worry and anxiety, is we think it's keeping us safe, and we get hyper vigilant and we try and predict everything and worry about everything. But the only time we can actually protect ourselves is right now. And if we show up right now. And so when you're not present, it actually is dangerous. And that actually increases your anxiety. And so I began developing and stumbling on a lot of tools to help retrain my brain, retrain my habit loops. I was finally able to work my way out of panic attacks. I was able to develop meditations and visualizations and exercises. It started to really, really turn my life around.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Um, it's, I'm curious actually how you came to mindfulness and meditation during that period, because, it sounds as though it was at a time when there weren't meditation apps, there were probably not a lot of centers. So what actually turned you on to mindfulness as a support?
When I was 8, and that's when my mom left, my parents got a divorce, I was bar singing a lot with my dad. And I saw people drinking to manage pain. That was very obvious to me at 8. They drank, they were in relationships, there was rage, there was anger. I just saw people in pain, and people, I didn't know the word medicating, but I saw people trying to cover up pain.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, it looked like you had an original pain, and then they layered it with all these distractions, and it became a mountain. And I watched people kill themselves when they could have just dealt with maybe this first pain. When you build up all these layers, it's hard to get back to here. You then have to get rid of all these pains to get back to this original pain, and you still have to deal with it. So I promised myself that I would never drink or do drugs, and that I would try and handle the pain as it came. And I was in a lot of pain. My dad became abusive at that age. And I was raised in a family of writers. Everybody wrote in my family, just for themselves. I was a very creative family. And so I started writing. And I noticed when I wrote, I felt calmer. I noticed when I wrote, I noticed patterns I didn't even know I noticed. I saw things. I saw reasons why my dad was doing what he did. It didn't make it feel better, but I saw patterns, and it was very empowering, and it took away a lot of my pain and made it manageable. That's a mindfulness technique, but I didn't know that word. But because of creativity, if you're curious and you're being observant, you're being mindful. So creativity is a really wonderful mindfulness exercise. And I noticed in my body that it made me feel differently. And so by being observant and curious, that was a skill I began to cultivate because it made my body feel better. So I began to cultivate it a lot. I was a very religious journaler. And so when I had that epiphany in the dressing room stealing a dress, and thought, okay, what if my thoughts are the key to my happiness? What am I thinking? I realized I couldn't keep track of my thoughts because of my anxiety. And I couldn't witness them in real time. I was not present. So I turned to writing. It was just a natural thing to me. And I started to take notes on what my hands did, because the hands are the servants of your thought. So if you want to see what you're thinking, watch what your hands are doing. It's your thought cooled down into action. And it was my way of kind of reverse engineering or hacking into my thoughts. It wasn't an amazing plan. I left there, I didn't steal the dress, and I was like, I guess I'm going to take notes on everything my hands do for 2 weeks. I mean, it's a silly plan, but it's kind of all I had. At the end of 2 weeks, I had a takeaway. I quit believing in myself. But the much more interesting thing was my anxiety virtually disappeared for 2 weeks, which was shocking. I mean, I did not expect that type of side effect, but it was so noticeable that I had to sit down and think about it. And I became more curious and more observant. Why did that work? What is it about that? And that's where I started really learning that I could stretch that moment out, from watching my hands all day to maybe washing my hands became an exercise where I forced myself to be present. Then I expanded it to when I walked upstairs, I felt every foot on every step. Now, there weren't words like mindfulness exercises, but that's basically what those things are and were. And I began to notice my body. And then I noticed my body either feels open or it feels closed. Now I would use the word dilated or contracted, but back then I just had it was this feeling or it was this feeling. And then I noticed every thought, action, or feeling leads to one of those two states. There's the only two basic states of being. That's all we got. And if we get really simple, if I got really simple, I realized I could hack my way out of an anxious state into a dilated state by forcing myself to participate in a thought, feeling, or action that caused me to dilate. So I began to make lists of every thought and feeling and action that caused me to go like this. And then I wrote down every thought, feeling, and action that caused me to go like this. And the first time I was able to ward off a panic attack, I remember so clearly, I felt it ramping up, which takes mindfulness to start to notice your triggers, to notice when it's happening before it happens. And then I really profoundly forced myself to become deeply grateful. And that's the trick. It can't be mental. You can't say, I'm grateful for my health. And it has to like really stimulate your whole system. And I was homeless, but I had the shade of this really beautiful palm tree, and the light was filtering through, and it was casting this beautiful shadow on my skin. And I just became moved to tears. I was alive. I hadn't killed myself. And I got to feel the sun on my skin. And I was so moved. It caused my whole system to open. And what we've learned through science now is there's a lot of science behind that. Our whole vascular system dilates. Our blood pressure drops. Our neurotransmitters change into calming, feel-good drugs like our serotonin and dopamine. Our cortisol levels decrease. And it's instant. Our body is listening to our thoughts. Our body is listening to our feelings. And so they're all connected. And I began to realize that I think about curating what I wear and what I eat, but I wasn't curating what I thought. And I realized not every thought and feeling is a fact. I remember reading Descartes, I think, therefore I am. And I realized it's I perceive what I think, therefore I am. I'm not my thoughts. I'm the observer of them. And once I wrote that down and realized that, I started to realize the key to my journey was going to be to develop a better relationship with the observer of me. You know, if our body is a car, our brain is not the driver. It's the steering wheel. It's a tool. It's a great tool.
Yeah.
And it can go on autopilot if we are not in the driver's seat. The observer is in the driver's seat. And so the more I can realize I'm not sad, I'm the observer of sad, that creates a gap. And to me, mindfulness is all about creating a gap. Here's sadness. Here's the observer. In this gap is a whole realm of places that I can change, that I can create an influence over what I feel. I can generate different actions, thoughts, and feelings to create different results. And it just became fascinating to me. I just started developing more and more exercises that got more and more specific to start to really attack very specific habits. I noticed things like what I called a triad at the time. It was a stimulus, a response, and a reward. You know, it was addiction. I was around addiction my whole life. I never got addicted to drugs, but I became addicted to shoplifting and anxiety and negativity and all kinds of other things. And I watched so many other drug addicts, and I was like, there must be a biological reason for addiction. It can't be like a mistake, like, oops, sorry about that, humanity. We made you, there's an addictive part of your brain. We're sorry. There must be a real biological, evolutionary reason we can be addicted. And so I started to wonder if I could get addicted to positive things. And so I looked at that triad of stimulus. For me was being homeless. I mean, I worked hard not to be, but it was a hard thing to affect immediately. My response was stealing, for instance. It made me feel in control, made me feel powerful, made me feel like I was caring for myself. And the reward was the biochemicals that come from that. And so I decided to work with the middle thing, my response. And so I began to abstain from stealing. I gave myself 2 weeks where it was just like hanging on by my nails not to steal. And I forced myself to write. It was the one habit I had that I thought would be a good replacement. And it took time. It wasn't immediately rewarding. Like writing didn't feel as exciting, right, as stealing. It wasn't this big, quick, overwhelming rush. But with time, my body resensitized itself, and it became profoundly rewarding in a much different way and calmingly rewarding. And then I became very prolific because I was very prolific at stealing. So I became very prolific at writing. And so as I learned that, I learned the word for it. It's called a habit loop. It isn't something I knew that word at the time. But you can then just specifically start to target any habit you have and rework it. Start to know what your stimulus is. Mainly look at your response because that's the easiest one to influence. Give it a couple weeks and you'll start to neurologically rewire your brain.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds a lot like kind of a cross between mindfulness and cognitive therapy, because that is the teaching of actually looking at our thoughts and developing a more skillful, balanced response to our thoughts. And, it can take a lot of time to learn this as well. Like, it's amazing that you taught yourself this on your own. As you were mentioning, the loop that you were referring to with neuroplasticity, our thought patterns become so ingrained. It's so difficult for us to change them. Negativity. I also experienced anxiety, generalized anxiety disorder, panic attacks, depression. And often it's like when we enter one challenge, it brings us into the next, right? Your homelessness led to anxiety, led to panic attacks, led to agoraphobia. So it's almost like the deeper we fall, the more we have to work with. And so I also think that with like healing from trauma, I think that it's important to recognize that we're all going to heal in different phases at different times. And, there's some people that come to mindfulness and are able to concentrate really quickly. There's some people that are able to resolve their issues because they don't have as much that we're working with. So I think we also need to be really patient with ourselves. I'm curious, as someone who's dealt with a lot of trauma, what has that process look like for you? Do you feel like you have resolved all the trauma, or do you feel like there's still, generally I think it happens in phases. What are you still working with in your life in regards to trauma?
Rewiring our brains can be a very daunting task. The way I always looked at it is we have one of two choices: suffer in a way where there's no better outcome. We'll just keep suffering. Or work really hard, which is difficult and it's a struggle, but at least there's a possible better outcome. So for me, being dysfunctional takes a lot of resources, takes a lot of energy. It's tiring to be dysfunctional. Mm-hmm. Now it's the pain we know. Trying to change is an unknown. And for people that have trauma, the unknown can sometimes be too big of a risk. So you'd rather stay with your suffering. So a lot of us actually really love our suffering. Our suffering feeds us in a way. It's a comfort. It's something familiar that we know. And to make the commitment to say, I'm willing to let go of something I know because it feeds me just enough, barely alive, but it does nourish me in some way. Can I give up the only nourishment I've ever known for something completely unknown? It's worth giving that some thought and honoring what that is, that psychologically your body perceives what you've been getting as nourishment, even if it isn't great nourishment. And you're going to give up the only source of nourishment you've known for a completely unknown outcome. I believe it's very worth it. It's very, very worth the journey, and it's very possible to rewire your brain. But you can't do everything at once. So it's important to start small. With mindfulness, I looked at meditation like going to the gym and building a muscle. So I'm meditating and I'm doing a bicep curl, which is kind of true. They've proven that you can build gray matter. You can create a new fold in your frontal lobe in as little as 8 weeks. And you can start to shrink your amygdala where your anxiety lives. So that's amazing. But it's like doing a workout. If you cannot apply that muscle to your life, it's a wasted skill. So to me, in my life, meditation wasn't enough because it wasn't going to give me the level of change I needed. How many times have we sat and meditated, and the second we're done, we go scream at our kid or engage in those habits that are so frustrating to us? Mm-hmm. You have to then take mindfulness, what I call into motion. And that to me has been where I've received the most benefit is doing the bicep curl, meditating, building my ability to be present, and then putting that presence to work to change habits. Speaking of trauma, things used to trigger me all the time. I didn't know. It took mindfulness to heal my trauma because I had to start becoming aware. A lot of times, and a lot of people will understand this, I was this way with shoplifting too. I woke up after it. I don't know what hit me. It was like all of a sudden I was like, holy crap, I swiped a banana or whatever it was. Then I started to notice the impulse in real time. Oh, I'm stealing something right now in real time. And I couldn't stop myself, but I was able to notice it. Then with time, I was able to notice I wanted to, but I still couldn't stop myself. But I did notice the impulse prior to doing it. And then lastly, I started to be able to influence that impulse. I began to be able to abstain. But it's a real process. And so when I realized, how do I describe it? With our most unflattering behaviors, we have a tendency to want to detach from them. We want to push them away. We don't want mindfulness around our unattractive personality traits or behaviors. And so we take a piece of us and we set it out over here and we try and starve it. But then it creates this tremendous hunger and it causes such a ruckus that it becomes a real problem in your life. And then you feel shame. Then you want to detach from it again and you shame yourself and you shame that behavior. The most counterintuitive thing we can do for healing our trauma and healing those behaviors is welcoming those less than attractive qualities close to us when we meditate. Sit with it, invite it in. Perfectionism is one I'm working with right now. It's a never ending addiction for me. I have worked on perfectionism so many years and I'm getting hit with it again really hard right now. And so I ask perfectionism to come in and to see it. It's kind of like if we have a child that it thinks it's bad, we have to bring it close to us. We have to let it know it's lovable.
Yeah.
We have to see what it is for it to transform. Yeah. You know, if energy can never cease to exist, you can't just section off a part of yourself and think it's going to go away. Mm-hmm. We have to think about transforming energy. We have to think about rededicating it. So a prayer I've learned, or a meditation or a mantra I've learned to say is, I sacrifice my attachment to, I'll say, perfectionism, and I dedicate it to compassion. I'm really bad at compassion. It's a really weak area for me. And perfectionism is actually stemmed from a lack of compassion. So to heal perfectionism, I have to dedicate that energy. And I have to create the same mindfulness around it, the same curiosity, the same observation, to not indulge in shame, but go, all right, yeah, here I did it again. It's not going to heal overnight. Mm-hmm. The quicker we can get to not shaming ourselves, bringing that energy in, allowing ourselves to look at it, having compassion, like, of course I'm a perfectionist. It's what I thought kept me safe my whole crazy ass life. Like, it makes sense. Yeah. Now I want to dedicate it to something. It starts to have change. That's not a direct trauma answer. I can talk about trauma more specifically, but it's just what came to mind.
Well, it's actually very valid and it's very profound because it impacts so much of your life. I kind of refer to myself as a recovering perfectionist.
Yeah.
So I can relate. And there's a lot of pieces of our story that are very similar. I had to move out when I was very young as well. I also shoplifted. My mother's probably watching this. She actually brought me once back to the store to return something when we were at a mall. That's a whole other story, but yeah, and I feel like a lot of our the way that you described recovering from shoplifting sounds very similar in regards to my path around having an eating disorder, and it really the compassion piece is really big. I wasn't really offered a lot of compassion. My father did not, there wasn't really support around being kind to oneself in my house. And so that's something I've really had to teach myself, and I'm still as well learning. And the more compassion that we can direct towards ourselves, of course, we can direct towards others. So, there's so many pieces to this big puzzle.
With trauma, I would say I did develop a really specific exercise to help myself through panic attacks. Mm-hmm. I'm happy to share that if you guys
I'd love to hear it. There's so many of our members experience that and suffer from it. So I'd love to hear it.
Yeah, trauma, I can say I'm 45 now, so I've been working on this a long time. My triggers, I rarely get triggered anymore. Mm-hmm. Understanding your triggers, understanding what they are, becoming curious. For me, I noticed if I had two big shifts in my life, if I was going to a new school, and if there was some other major shift, maybe I didn't have a friend there, and so I didn't have support, and I was in a new place or something like that. If my job was shifting and where I was living was shifting, if there was more than one pillar changing, one pillar was a risk for me. If one major pillar foundational thing was changing, I was at risk. If two were changing, I had to have an absolute strategy. Learning that really helped me. I could plan now. You know, if I knew two things were happening, I would have some kind of system. I didn't always have friends or support groups, and so I had to develop other systems and other techniques. But for me, my panic attacks started when I was 16. It was when I went away to school. No idea what they were. You do feel like you're dying when you have your first one, and really a lot of times afterwards too. They're pretty awful. I started a meditation where, you know, I would be in the fetal position and they would really be getting me. And I began to imagine I was out on a boat at sea, and I would imagine the waters in all its worst stormy biblical appearance, you know, incredibly huge waves. You feel like you're going to be overtaken, storm, the smell of lightning in the air. I would smell it, you know, the smell of a storm, the smell of the salt. I'd feel the spray on my skin. And then I would get up on the edge of the boat and I would fall backwards. And it got instantly quiet. And as I drifted down, it felt very peaceful and very relaxing. And I would imagine the feeling of the water on my skin, that there wasn't the waves anymore. I was in the water where it just was, it had a stillness. And then the colors started changing. I began to see sunbeams coming through the water. I could taste the salt on my lips. The light went from a dark to a light blue to a really light green. And I would reach the sandy bottom and I'd feel the sand on my back. And by the time I got down through that process, I was pretty calm. Usually, as I learned, and it takes a ton of focus to do this when you're having a panic attack. So I appreciate, and I hope you can appreciate, this took a lot of practice to get myself to this point where I was able to visualize this. It took a lot of dedication. Then I learned when I was on the bottom of the ocean, I could ask myself questions and I would get answers. That's the really cool thing about mindfulness. You know, we have an intelligence beyond our brain. There's a body intelligence. So I began to ask myself, why am I so scared? And I would start to see why. I would see something that triggered me and I didn't realize it triggered me. I would just start to hear things and feel answers. And it became an incredibly powerful tool, not only for calming myself down, but for then also helping me become aware of things I hadn't been aware that I noticed. With time and learning more about EMDR, is that what it's called, over the years. So if you've ever seen an MRI of a brain having a panic attack, the blood pulls out of your frontal lobes where you have reason and logic, and your amygdala lights up and your cortisol levels rise. So your brain literally goes offline. There is no blood here. It can't think. It can't be reasonable. You can't be logical. What I accidentally stumbled onto was tasting the smell of and the salt and the smells in the air and seeing the colors. My brain had to deal with information, even though it was imaginary. I was able to visualize strong enough the taste and the smell and the color that my brain had to process it. What it did is force blood back into those parts of my brain. It essentially brought my brain back online. There are lots of skills. If you don't want to do that visualization of falling back into the water, that's just what I came up with. You can come up with anything. But really important things are smell, taste, touch, information your brain has to deal with. A friend of mine was having panic attacks. They'd happen while he was driving. And he'd become hyper observant and curious about the road signs, the letters. He'd try and play Scrabble with the letters. Same thing. It's just forcing his brain to deal with information to keep that blood flowing to that part of the brain. And again, with time, I'm rarely triggered. Rarely. It really does feel like a different person a long time ago. And this was somebody who was agoraphobic and, you know, really suffering. So it's very possible.
Yeah. That's amazing. It's an amazing journey, and you've clearly done a lot of work to get here. And I mean, sensory experience really pulls us into the present. So I love that exercise as well. It sounds like a really beautiful visualization. I wanted to talk about your new single, Grateful. When you were talking about gratitude before, it's interesting because often there's the idea that we're going to experience gratitude when things fall into line and we have what we long for, and that's often not the case. And sometimes it's actually when we're struggling that we're able to appreciate the smallest things. So I'd love you to talk a little bit about your single.
Yeah, I wrote gratitude based on what I was talking about earlier, of there being two basic states of being, dilated and contracted. Gratitude was the quickest way for me to hack out of anxiety. I learned in a weird way to be grateful for my anxiety, because our bodies try and communicate with us, and they don't have our feeling body's different, than our intellectual brain. When I was anxious, I realized it was just my body trying to communicate that something I was doing didn't agree with me. I mean, kind of that simple. Something I just thought, some behavior I just did, some person that was around me. It was my body's only way of saying, hey, this isn't agreeing with our authentic nature. So I began to look at anxiety eventually as like a really cool neon sign, where instead of me dreading it, I was like, I'd get very curious. Like, what was I just thinking? What was I just doing? My body's trying to talk to me. So I began to look at it as an ally. And when that didn't work, when it didn't make sense and I couldn't understand my anxiety, I would turn to gratitude, because it does force your whole system to dilate. It's such a simple act of empowerment. For me, when I was homeless, I didn't realize I was a victim mentality, but stealing is. It's thinking I can't provide for myself. I don't have enough. I have to take it. I have to manipulate my environment to get it. Mm-hmm. And when I realized nobody's coming for me, I'm coming for me, it's very empowering. I'm going to do this. Nobody owes me anything. I owe myself something. There is no excuse not to be happy. We can all make up as many excuses as we want. And I had a lot of good ones while I was homeless. It seems really justifiable. But if I wanted to change, it wouldn't work. And so gratitude was so powerful. So the song is about the power of gratitude, the power of that no politician, nothing can take away our happiness unless we give it to them, unless we allow it to be taken. And so realizing it's in all these little moments that we can gain our power, that we can gain our happiness, and really becoming aware of all the little moments I was giving it away. So it's just about gratitude. It was the only thing I felt like I could offer during this time that felt soothing and like a balm, because that's what it was for me. It was my medicine and my balm, and I hope it feels that way for other people.
Yeah. I think people are needing as much soothing as possible right now. So, yeah, I'm looking forward to hearing it. So, it's out right now?
Yep, it's out right now.
Okay.
Streaming platforms.
Okay.
It's called Grateful.
Awesome. And, last, I know we're stretching our time out, but I'd love to hear a little bit about your foundation, just to let people know about a lot of different tools. So maybe you can just chat about that a little bit.
Yeah. I formed a youth foundation about 18 years ago. I wanted to work with at-risk youth, kids with some serious suicidal ideation and anxiety disorders, really difficult backgrounds. And they have no access to therapy the same way I didn't have access to those things. And I took the toolkit of the mindfulness skills and created a curriculum out of it. And I'm really proud. Our kids, 99% of them earned their own college scholarships. 90% of them were Ivy League.
Amazing.
But it's just a side effect of the journey each of these children were willing to go through, which when you know what that journey is, it's daunting. Mm-hmm. But each one of them answered this call of my happiness is my own and I'm going to fight for it. And I'm not going to blame my parents and I'm not going to blame my socioeconomic background. I have power and I'm going to find out what that power is. And these kids go from multiple suicide attempts to just being these beacons of light. And then when they go into Princeton, one of our girls got into Princeton, Georgetown, a lot of amazing universities. A lot of the other kids don't have good mental health, mm-hmm. So these kids with more privileged backgrounds weren't given emotional skill sets, and they suffer greatly. As we all know, anybody can suffer. You don't have to be at risk to do it. We're all at risk for suffering. And to see our kids go in and start meditation groups and to start support groups and to start healthy sleep habits, text chains, like, are you guys going to bed? Check in, go to bed early tonight. Knowing enough sleep affects our mental health. It's amazing to see these kids go on and do that. We created a website called jewelneverbroken.com, jewelneverbroken.com. And it has a lot of these mindfulness tools up for free. It's a 501(c)(3). They were proven to work by Dr. Judson Brewer, who's an amazing neuroscientist.
He worked with us on in our app actually as well.
Yeah, he's wonderful. And so he goes and it kind of explains why these habits do neurologically rewire you. They're simple 3-minute exercises. You know, I had to make things doable for myself. One thing that I can focus on until I cultivate that habit.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, it's so lovely. You know, I feel like, you know, you were talking about the fact that mindfulness is supporting, has supported these kids so much. I feel like mindfulness in general is supporting so many of us right now. There's a lot of long-term meditators that I've been talking to, and it just kind of feels like we're in a long-term retreat. So, you know, I love that you're working with these kids and offering the tools to succeed in life.
It is
Yeah,
neat to see them go through this, like you say, when you have already overcome so much and you've developed the skill set. COVID isn't as scary.
yeah, yeah,
A lot of
yeah. I
people,
mean, one of the big teachings in mindfulness is impermanence. And when you know that there's an end and you've experienced working with impermanence in an experiential way, um, you're not as fraught with the feeling that this is going to last forever, which for many of us, it feels like this is forever. It's just lasting for so long. So I think moving into the present, recognizing that there will be an end, that this will pass, and that we're going to survive and we'll be okay. These tools are really supportive right now. So
yeah, I say again, it is so important what you're saying. And then if I was to take it a little further, this is a great time to mindfully ask ourselves interesting questions to create, you know, an in motion practice of what do I want to get out of this time?
mhm,
Mindfully presently ask yourself, what do I want to get out of this experience? This experience is happening whether we like it or not. You know, we
yeah,
can gain something out of it if we're really mindful and thoughtful about it. Maybe you've always wanted to learn to breathe and you never have, or you want to learn to meditate and now's the time. What do you want to let go of? You know, maybe there's things in your life you're realizing I was too busy, or my kids were overscheduled, or my job is toxic and this scares me, but I have to leave it. Who, I don't know what, but
mhm,
what do you want to leave behind? What new skill do you want to gain? And how can you apply it? And if you can create a little actionable plan, that's going to retrain us neurologically. We're going to come out of this better, which we should, right? If we're going to go through this, why not come out of it better than more pathologically afraid? And that's up to us. And so just three
mhm.
simple questions like that can really, again, make you feel very empowered during a very frightening time.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, with all suffering comes great opportunity. So
Yeah.
yeah. Well, this was so lovely. I'm so glad that you were able to spend this time with us. And again, if you want to check out Jules' new single, it's called Grateful, and her website is Jewel Never Broken. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
JewelNeverBroken.com.
.com. Yeah. Okay. Awesome. Thank you so much. And
Thanks for your time. I'm a big
yeah,
fan. I didn't get to say that in the beginning. I really love what you guys are doing. It's really incredible, and I just can't wait to be able to get to know you more. And thanks for your time today.
yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you. All right.
All right.
Bye.
Bye. Bye, everybody. Thank you so much for having me.